before we begin, I'd like to thank the Irish Research Council, which is supporting the event through an award under the new foundation scheme. We've planned a rich programme of presentations and discussions for the day ahead, and we hope that will unfold seamlessly in this ever strange but now familiar online universe. We'll hear from artists, researchers, and artist researchers from across, in between and beyond the disciplines of sound art, theatre, music, dance, and visual art, working both in and out of Ireland. Full details of the event and the participants are available in the programme, which I think you've received, I hope so. This morning we begin with our first panel session, and that is presentation session. And this is followed at 12:30 by the launch of a new publication, The Artist and Academia. At 2, we return for our second panel of presenters, and we end the day with a roundtable discussion at 3:30. We hope that you'll participate in the discussions over the course of the day. The session chairs will say a little bit more about how we'll manage that at the top of each session. And as I think you may have seen, I certainly just saw on my screen there now, the sessions are being recorded, and they will be available then for viewing and reviewing on the imbas.ie website. I hope that we'll get those up in the next week or so. Speaking of chairs, I'm delighted now to pass over to my dear friend and colleague, the West Limerick flute and piano player, ethnomusicologist, global Irish music specialist and popular music scholar, Aileen Dillane, who is going to chair our first session this morning. Over to you, Aileen.
Thank you, Mel, and thank you for inviting me to do this. I'm delighted to be here today. We've got a lineup of 3 fantastic speakers. You will see on the screen below there's a chat box, and can I encourage you, as you're listening to each of the presenters, jot something down on paper first maybe, and then think about things. And when you're ready to ask a question, you can type it into the chat box. And at the end of the 3 presentations, along with my colleague Kevin McNally, we'll facilitate those questions. I'll be asking on your behalf because this is the platform we're using today. I'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible, but the chat box will also be available to the presenters to read afterwards as well, and there may be other mechanisms by which you can catch up with them at a later date when we're all together in a room, hopefully. So my role today is to present each of the speakers, to encourage them to stick to a 20-minute presentation, and then to facilitate that discussion. Very briefly, today is about examining the relationship between artistic practice and research. And oftentimes, especially in a university context, we can tend to think of research as taking precedence, and those who are practitioners in a university context need to speak or present their research in particular kinds of ways. But actually, research and practice is much more recursive than that. So while people doing arts practice PhDs or academics will talk about and present their practice, we have to often fight to make sure that people in academia understand that practice itself is embodied knowledge and is research in and of itself. And similarly, I think arts practitioners often think about themselves as practitioners and maybe don't necessarily think of all the research and embodied knowledge that they hold and they can abstract and give to people. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, this kind of dynamic. And our first speaker then this morning to kick things off is my very lovely colleague, Dr. Kathleen Turner, who is a singer, songwriter and community musician based here in the Irish World Academy. And Kathleen is going to be getting her slides up and ready to go as I'm introducing her. She completed her arts practice PhD in 2017, doing amazing work with the Irish Chamber Orchestra and the Sing Out with Strings, which was very much based on the insights of children and teachers involved in the project. Kathleen is now the co-chair of the Commission for Community Music, and her presentation today is going to be focusing on her first album, which she wants to talk about in relation not just to agency and vulnerability, but also a kind of feminist perspective and celebrating women. And so, Kathleen, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Aileen. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay and see the screen? I'm hoping so. Great. Okay. Well, listen, I'm so delighted to have the opportunity to present to you today. I'm going to be speaking to you about the process of developing my first album of original work, and in particular exploring how some of the processes I used and learned during my PhD in arts practice impacted how I engage now in my arts practice as a singer and songwriter. I spoke to a friend of mine last week here at the Academy who is also a musician and an arts practice researcher, and we agreed that since we started to engage in this type of research through the PhD, a gig is never just a gig anymore. There's always something more we're trying to find out. So I'm a singer and a songwriter, an arts practice researcher, a facilitator, and a community musician. I completed my PhD in arts practice here at the Academy back in 2017. And during that, I used an autoethnographic framework that included narrative inquiry, storytelling, singing, songwriting, and community performance. And 2 years later, in December 2019, I released my first album, Like a Lion, which is where this image taken by the photographer Deirdre Power comes from. The intention at that point was to use this album not as a final creative output, but as a first step, as an impetus for a bigger project investigating women's perspectives and experiences, particularly following the referendum on the 8th Amendment here in Ireland, and especially on our articulations of anger or rage, a space that I believe is still not easily accessible for women in Ireland or elsewhere. So in order to take you through the process of developing the album, we need to go back in time. I've been a songwriter in some capacity throughout my life, but I began performing and recording my own songs in 2014. And at the same time, I was pursuing the PhD in arts practice at the Academy. And through that experience, I began to experiment with using my singing and songwriting and the stories that framed the songs as part of an investigative toolkit to examine wider social, political, and cultural issues. In other words, I was using my singing and my songwriting as autoethnography. Adams et al. Say that when we do autoethnography, we look inward into our identities, thoughts, feelings, and experiences, and outward into our relationships, our communities, and our cultures. I think a process of investigation is inherent to varying degrees intuitively in what we do as artists. However, this targeted use of songwriting to address a specific question, critically engaging with our lived experiences in relationship to wider society, that process changed the way I wrote songs, and it also changed the way I felt songs in my body. They no longer felt like standalone pieces of music. They were now a complex questioning narrative that evolved in conversation with research or reflection. Every time I sang those songs, they helped me to recall a specific memory, a perspective, or a new piece of knowledge that I had gained in the process of writing. Patricia Levy says that as artist researchers, we see and build in different shapes. She says we are carving new research tools, and in doing so, we are shaping our knowledge building and our transmission. With that in mind, I use the tools of songs and stories to carve out spaces for me to think, to interrogate the meaning, the impact, the consequence, and the relationship between particular events over time. I found that I could investigate not only through text, but through lyrics, through the intentional direction of my vocals, through storying experiences to step outside of them, examine them, and step back in. Chase describes this kind of reflexive narrative practice as meaning making, through the shaping or ordering of experience, understanding one's own or others' actions, organizing events and objects into a meaningful whole, and connecting and seeing the consequences of actions or events over time. I particularly resonated with the concept of narrative as organizing experiences into a meaningful whole. This started to manifest in my songwriting through the recurring metaphors of navigation, mapping, and wayfinding, which eventually brought me to this album. So in the true form of storying the experience, let me set the scene with a very blurry photograph. By 2017, I was on the Clore Leadership Programme, funded by the Arts Council of Ireland. And during this fellowship, I had a period of special research leave following my PhD to research different strands from my areas of interest: community music, social justice, cultural leadership, and in particular, examples of women in leadership. I had a range of deeply impactful experiences during the fellowship, and at the same time, the lead up to the referendum on the 8th Amendment was happening in Ireland. At that time, I didn't have a vote on a constitutional issue, so whilst I am an Irish woman, an issue that concerned me was being decided without me. And concurrently, I was studying examples of cultural leadership, so I was feeling in equal parts inspired and enraged, empowered and muted. During one of my fellowship coaching sessions, I reminisced with my coach that I missed boxing, an old hobby of mine. And I said to my coach, I wish I had that now, because when I boxed, I used to go in like a lion and leave like a lamb. And she asked me, why do you need to be a lamb? What if you just went in like a lion to everything? Career goals, meetings, challenging situations. What if you didn't have to contain yourself? What if you just go in like a lion and stay that way? This is where the album Like a Lion came from. It was an attempt to make a space where I didn't feel the need to contain myself. I began collecting artifacts of experiences and observations when I encountered other people, especially women, going in like a lion. I'm going to show you an example of that now. This video extract is taken from a school's cultural festival called Polyfest. It's a brilliant example of community music and practice that I visited as part of my fellowship in New Zealand. And I'm going to invite you to pay particular attention to the young woman in the front who leads the group. She has white across her shoulders. And I'll play that for you now. During this part of my trip, it was explained to me that by being her fullest self as a leader, this young woman gave permission to everyone else in her community on that stage to do the same. When it came to writing and recording the album, I wanted to translate some element of that spirit, being our fullest selves as women in Ireland in a multitude of ways. The image or action of going in like a lion persisted and eventually became the title track. I began gathering facts. A lion's roar can be heard up to 5 miles away. They function as a close-knit community, and the females are leaders in the hunt. I began gathering words, phrases from conversations I had both in person and online about feelings surrounding the referendum. Rage that caught in a woman's throat. A feeling that we're never enough or a little bit too much. They wove their way into melody and lyrics, and I began to organize experiences into a meaningful whole. Like this verse. I like to scream it, but it catches in my throat. Illegal body, and I never got to vote. And when I roar, you'll hear me 50 miles away. What will unravel when we cross the state line? I continued to write and reflect, gathering scraps of my observations and experiences. Essentially, that was the first stage of gathering autoethnographic data. When I completed the fellowship, I was left with several filled notebooks, photos, audio and video on my phone. This was a clear picture. This was without a clear picture of where I was going exactly, but I knew that if I didn't begin to make something, it would keep me awake at night. So over the course of the next year, I recorded 10 songs with Sean O'Graham, a multi-instrumentalist and producer who was very sensitive to the aims of the project and engaged in a very generous dialogic process from start to finish. After we completed the album, I collaborated with aerial artists Dr. Jennifer De Bruyne, Maura D, and Aisling the colleague to make a video that in part began to articulate the muscle of the pride. This was supported by Limerick City and County Council and Creative Ireland as part of the Made in Limerick series. Outside of the album itself, this video is equally as demonstrative of this early stage of the investigative process as the words. So I'm going to show you that now. So bear with me and I'll...
Everyone's looking when we smile and bare our chests. Not so inviting when we smile and bare our teeth. Careful informers of the lines we're not to cross. What will unravel when we pass the stop sign? We're meant to make sure that we're never a little too much. We tell each other that we've always been enough, and that's the way it's always been. You haven't seen me going like a lion. Our teeth and our claws, yes, we'll tear it apart with the might of our jaws, yes, the muscle of the pride. Daughters at our side. Look what happens when we go in like a lion. When we go in like a lion. Like a lion, I like to scream it, but it catches in my throat. Illegal body, and I never got to vote. And when I roar, you'll hear me 50 miles away. What will unravel when I cross the state line? Well, it's the kind of game where everyone's got skin, but take a look around and never wanted in, and that's the way it's always been. You haven't seen me going like a lion. Our teeth and our claws, yes, we'll tear it apart with the might of our jaws, yes, the muscle of the pride. Daughters at in the silence, in the story, in the violence, in the waking, in the dying, in the holding, in the trying, in the pushing, in the loving, in the marching, in the roaring like a lion. Our teeth and our claws, yes, we'll tear it apart with the might of our jaws, yes, the muscle of the pride. Daughters at our side. Look what happens when we go in like a lion. Our teeth and our claws, yes, we'll tear it apart with the might of our jaws, yes, the muscle of the pride. Daughters at our side. Look what happens when we go in like a lion. When we go in like a lion, like a lion.
After the album, we created 2 of these videos, and I intended to develop the project as a broader creative process involving live performance with ensemble vocals, musicians, and some aerial dance. I had ideas about involving the audience and gathering responses, and I wasn't sure what would come next, but I assumed we had the space and the time to find out. But that was in March 2020, and we all know what happened next. This presentation is my first opportunity to gather the threads of this project again, asking how and where we established spaces for women to be, and more specifically, to rage. I'm hoping that now I'll continue to use these songs and new compositions as a productive and useful way of coming to know, as David Carliss says, the answer to this question. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening.
Thank you, Kathleen. That was wonderful, and to time and to schedule. Can I encourage people to be thinking about questions that they might have for Kathleen and put them into the chat box? As I said, Kevin McNally and I will be monitoring that, so don't be afraid that we'll miss your question. We will have to select possibly, but yeah, that was really powerful. Kathleen, thank you very much. I'm sure there are lots of people who have questions for you. All right, ever so slightly ahead of schedule, which is a wonderful thing to be able to say, we'll turn to our second speaker. And Wayne Jordan is a writer, performer and director, and for a long time his work was associated with the Abbey Theatre, where he trained as an assistant director, and he was also an associate artist. And in 2017 Wayne took a break from his career in Ireland, and he decided to work and study at the drama faculty of the Prague University of the Performing Arts, called DAMU. And he worked with alternative theatre and puppet theatre. And while there, he developed a number of works of his own that had to do with his own body and autobiography. I think we'll see that autobiography is quite a strong theme in today's session. To create ceremonies and performances that focus on intimacy, image, and audience engagement and participation. And so Wayne's presentation today is to take you through that process, especially now as he has returned to Dublin and brought his newly shaped practice back with him. So Wayne, thank you for being here today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, cool. Thanks very much. I hope I can be as organized as Kathleen, but I doubt it. So my name is Wayne Jordan, and I'm a theatre director. I studied at Trinity College, and I went pretty quickly into practicing as a drama theatre director. What I mean by that was that I was interpreting plays. So I was directing plays that were written by other people. The odd time written by myself, but usually by other people, either dead writers or living writers. Some of whom I worked with, some of whose plays I just licensed. I was making a lot, by the time 2017 hit, I was making a lot of very large scale work with, you know, large casts. I was making some musical theatre, some opera and so on. And I had begun to feel that the theatre, which for so long, or originally for me, had been a site of revelation and personal expression, had kind of become a mask and was kind of no longer really serving. I wasn't putting myself at risk or taking risks, I guess, at the level I wanted, and I wasn't quite sure how to do that anymore. I felt that the fact that text was so key to the tradition in which I was working was a block to discovering more of what was possible for myself and for the work that I wanted to make. And I also was becoming a little bit fatigued by the prevalence of psychology continually in the rehearsal room. So for those of you who, I guess many of you don't work in the theatre, in the rehearsal room, we're traditionally working with ideas of what the character wants, what the character needs, and there was just a lot of talk of I want and I need, and also a lot of talk about truth. And I was beginning to become very suspicious of what the truth meant, because I found that people were generally saying that they thought something felt true or was true when they were seeing delivered back to them an idea of the world that they already had, and I wanted to find something else. So in 2017, I packed my bags and I moved to Prague, and I went back to university to study in the Faculty of Alternative Theatre and Puppetry in the Prague Academy of Dramatic Arts. I met a woman called Sadia Lotker, who was is a Serbian dramaturg who started an English language program there. And I, I wasn't quite sure what it was I was going into, but I knew that I wanted something new, and it was a kind of Narnia of a world that I kind of entered into. I will just share very quickly now a video so you have some visuals to look at, which is kind of related to the work, or is of the work while I'm talking. So when I entered the drama school there, the focus of the work was on objects and no longer on acting. And the word research was absolutely paramount when we were working and looking at anything. We were encouraged always to be researching, to think of all our performances as research as much as the rehearsal and the practice itself, that we would always be trying to find more, that we would never be settling, and that the work was always growing and continuing. And the school, or the part of the school that I was in, had begun as a puppet, had become as a puppet school, and somewhere in the late 20th century, took on also the title of alternative. So it was called the School of Alternative and Puppet Theatre, which set it in I guess in contrast or opposition to the other part of the school, which was the Tríona department, which in Czech means drama. So people were, the staff, the students were always trying to work with the idea of what was not drama theatre, what was alternative, and what was experimental. And the background for the experiments that they were making was puppetry and working with objects and working with materials. So what then became central to my practice, well, my studies first and then my practice, was an idea of material research. So to explain, I guess, was we would go to class every day, or these workshops every day, and we would work with materials. Those materials might be paper or water or bread, maybe plastic sheets, various kind of materials, potatoes, which I'll show you some work related to that later on. And we would watch each other play with these materials. We were kind of coached, and we coached each other to find ways of being with the materials that didn't involve manipulating them, forcing them into situations, telling stories with them that didn't come from the materials themselves. So there was a very strong sense of trying to be with material, to listen deeply to what the material might want, to treat the material always as an equal partner, and to allow any improvisation or work that we are creating to grow from a deep relationship with whatever the material was that we were working with at the time. And this had a profound effect on my understanding. I don't know what that noise is there, because can you all hear that noise? Sorry.
Yeah, it's muted now.
Okay, grand. Yes, well, what was possible within any practice for me, basically. And I started to understand a new way of being with basically the form of the theatre, a way of thinking with other people, a way that was less about kind of high intensity, showing off, interpreting, demonstrating, and became more about being with, listening, sharing, thinking with, and yes, and this, I guess this then was a beginning for a series of works that I then made, applying the experiences and lessons that I learned of being with materials to my own body and also to my own autobiography. So I will show you first. I just need to do this, and then I will do this. You should not be seeing that. You should be seeing that. Great. Yeah, so the video that you're seeing now is just a video of a piece that I made in class, which was one of the first works that I made. This work is called The Potato Piece. It'll just play around in the background. It was a work that I made by spending time with potatoes. The way that I made it was to sit in a room with some potatoes for a very long time. I stood on them, I rolled on them, I held them, I moved them until I could find basically a way that I could get the potatoes to work with me and speak. And in this instance, I ended up making a work that was really still very much a staging. As you can see, the table is a stage pretty much, and the potatoes are performing on the stage by kind of moving and rolling. I was using the potatoes in a way because I wanted to work with a kind of banal object, but I also wanted to find a way while I was living abroad to be with Ireland. And the potato was a kind of obvious symbol, I guess. At the same time, I was trying not to treat or over egg the idea of the symbolism of the potato, which doesn't necessarily have the same meanings in the Czech Republic anyway. But it had a kind of, I guess it was a secret totem for me. This work is probably the closest thing to a puppet work that I made, and is really kind of a very early piece of work that I was developing in the school. And you can see how it kind of develops forward, and I worked with another puppeteer to create it. It was a work about kind of multiplicities, about difference and repetition, and very much just an exploration of how one could work through being with materials. I wrote a brief list of ways in which being with materials created a kind of menu, which I could move kind of forward in my work with, and I'll just read them out now, which is alongsidedness, to be with objects, to be with materials without necessarily trying to make them do anything, and so therefore the associations between the performer and the thing could kind of sing itself. I developed a practice of ongoingness, which is to treat whatever I was working with as if it had had a life before I met it and would have a life continuing afterwards. And so that anything that happened in the engagement, the performative engagement, needed to take responsibility for what came before and what came after. Working with objects and things made me slow down, and I kind of started to take into my rehearsal research a practice of tarrying, which is just to be with something in order to see how that thing could speak. I was looking very much at scale. Objects and materials have obviously their own scale. A huge sheet of paper is going to have a very different scale to a very small pebble. Something that lives in geological time, like a stone, is going to have a really different scale to something fast like a feather. And I would try and find ways in which I could either enter into the scale of the object of the material in rehearsals or in the research practice, or that I could get the object to enter into my scale or time, and then perhaps to find a way that the object and I could meet in another time, some place between the two of us. I developed a practice of always looking for and trying to. I can hear myself there. I'm not sure what's going on. Yeah. 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 Hello. Yeah. I developed a practice of always trying to look for consent with the material. So, you know, obviously a material is going to tell you whether it's consenting to the way in which you're working with it by ripping or choking you or not working or breaking. And so one would kind of look for ways in which you could work with materials and objects that allowed both of you to perform side by side with each other. I was very influenced by a quotation, well, not directly a quotation, but a paraphrasing of the ideas of Socrates, that one would always know nothing and be nobody's teacher. I guess having come from a background of kind of being an expert or someone with a lot of experience, or a director who was always sitting outside and judging and looking in, I found that being in a situation where I was always in a state of experimentation rather than a state of, or rather being the function of the interpreter or the facilitator, allowed me to be in situations in rehearsals and with my research where something new could happen. I wasn't just implementing an idea that I already had in order to make some sort of production. As you can see, I kind of already mentioned it with the potato. There was this idea always of the thing or the object as the material as totem. What were the symbolic possibilities of the object, and what were the what was, in what ways was the object in excess of itself? How did it have the cultural resonances or the ghosts of humans in it? With the potato piece, that was obviously something that to do, well, it was obvious to me. It was related to the famine, hunger, Irishness as a kind of heaviness. Yeah, and maybe we'll see in more of them in the work. And then just this the last point I'd make is that objects taught me to kind of approach things indirectly, by indirection to find direction out, to not necessarily go immediately for the thing or the idea that I thought I wanted to communicate, but instead to sit with the object or the material. These methods that I'm describing now, or rather ways of being with material, aspects of being with material, then I found could be applied to other ways of being. So if I wanted to work with silence, for example, as a theme, I could take this idea of consent, being with, being indirect, to that theme. And if I wanted to work with a political theme, that was also possible. And it became the same when I wanted to work with my autobiography. I'll just put on another one of those there. And why is that doing that? Sorry. Yeah. Okay, maybe I'll just talk because I seem to have made that go away. Can I find it again? Yes. Yeah. So the next part of work I did after working with objects was I knew that I wanted to work with my body. Having been a director who had sat outside and watched and told people what to do for a really long time, I wanted to find a way of going deep into myself, putting myself into the performative situation and trying to figure out who I was as an artist. From working with materials, I had found that being simple and listening to what was there was a very, had opened up whole avenues for me of ways of thinking about what it was that I was showing and how I could share time and space with audiences. Before that, as a drama theatre director, I was always trying to, I guess, really kind of like impress, create consensus, and demonstrate the virtuosic. When I went to work in my body, and I guess you could call what I was doing, I'm going to press play there, dancing. I certainly am not a trained dancer, and I have a very, I guess, a larger person's body. I guess I was working with something that I didn't know very well, that I wasn't going to be able to, initially anyway, move in or manipulate in a way that was virtuosic, but instead it would slow me down, force me to be simple, to be with, and allow me to find connections to I can hear that there as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just, sorry, Wayne, can I just ask everybody to double check, please, that you are on mute because there are some sounds coming in. Thanks. Go ahead, Wayne.
Sorry about that. Thanks so much. To slow me down and also find a new connection to expression, which perhaps I had lost in trying to prove excellence, actually, in my former practice. So in this work, I spent a lot of time in a room moving around until themes and ideas about who I was and what I was and how I had ended up in the body that I was in kind of came to me and developed, and I found something to share with an audience. I also began to really think about how I was with people and what I presented. And so in making this piece, I also invited my mother to come to Prague and to make a speech about what I was like when I was a little boy. I wanted to kind of create a kind of another aspect on who I was and on the body. I had to spend a lot of time speaking with my mother to try and help her. She's a very natural communicator, but not necessarily a natural writer, to help her find a way to express what it was that she wanted to say. All the words that she spoke were her own, but I maybe made some provocations. My mother's memory of me as a young boy is very different to mine. My memory is of me being very unhappy, and hers is of me being very, very, playing and sunny and bright and blonde. So the space between those two things became quite an important part of the project, and also maybe quite an important part of a change in my relationship with my mother. What I found in applying the experiences that I had with objects and materials to myself, to themes, and to other materials was that in kind of listening, being with, associating, allowing the other, very unexpected things could happen, both in the performance, in the rehearsals, in the collaborations, and also, I guess, in my life. Although that sounds, I guess, in a way like the work was psychotherapeutic, I actually think that because I don't kind of necessarily, I'm not explicit about the way in which my autobiography is in the work, I would hope to think that I become a kind of, the performance becomes a kind of conduit for the audience to associate, to apply their own thought, to imagine their own mothers, to think about their own bodies, and to reflect and associate, which is very different from trying to get them to either agree to or move through an argument that either a playwright is making or I was making in and of myself. And then the final work that I made at the, I think I've just done that.
Actually, Wayne, I think we've come to the end of your time, so maybe
okay. I can just say very, very quickly that the last work that I didn't move into was a work that I made with a large group of people, and I moved from basically working on myself and with my body into a series of connections. You saw a very brief clip of this when people were running around in the earlier video, was into making connections with other people, with collaborators, and into a kind of more intense engagement and intimate engagement with audiences, where we were bringing audiences into the performance and into the tasks and sharing the experiences that we'd had working with kind of objects and materials and rehearsals, and working with them in that moment. So thank you very much.
Wayne, thank you very much. Really appreciate that presentation, and a number of very interesting questions have come up in the chat already, which we will turn to at the end of the session. It's interesting, I mentioned before Wayne's presentation, autobiography was going to be important, but another theme that seems to be emerging very much so is consent and the consensual. And I think we're going to find that in our final presentation for this morning's sessions too. And our speaker today is, final speaker for this morning's session is Lisa McLoughlin.
Oh, hi, can you all hear me?
I think there's something happening here.
Oh, okay.
Just 1 second, folks. I'm having a, see me now, guys? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah. Can hear you now.
So Lisa McLoughlin is the current head of dance at the Arts Council. She was awarded her PhD in arts practice in September of 2020 at the Irish World Academy of Music and Dance. And Lisa's research was funded by the Irish Research Council. She was trained in dance at the Rambert School in London, and she's performed extensively nationally and internationally with the Liz Roach Dance Company, Dagda Dance, Shíocháin, and a number of other companies. Her most recent choreography, The Kindness of Strangers, was commissioned by Live Collision at the International Festival of Live Art in 2019. She's the lead artist and designer of the Autonomy project from 2018, a multi-genre project encompassing of work for over 100 young people, artists and academics. And she holds a BA in first class honours MA, and she wanted me to mention that she is the mother of 3 wonderful children, and that's definitely worth mentioning. So her presentation today will discuss how arts practice can be used as a robust and agile tool for allowing space for non-consensus. And I think this will perhaps bring many of the themes we've heard in the previous presentations together. And as I say, I encourage you to write your questions in the chat box, and we will facilitate those questions once Lisa has finished. Lisa, it's great to see you, and thank you for your presentation.
Thanks, Aileen. Thanks for that introduction also. So yeah, I thought I'd start with a video that was kind of the end of my research. And this was the only time that I brought it all back to my body. My research, as Aileen has kind of begun to outline, involved a lot of people. My first work involved 100 people. I invited about 80 people to make work. And the final piece that I made that you'll see parts of here, called The Kindness of Strangers, I walked with 184 people. It's a very specific number, and I'll tell you why. Arm in arm in 4 cities in Ireland. And I'll just show you this kind of end result of that work. And I suppose you'll hear an overdub of my cousin, who is kind of a bit of a genius mathematician. He's Professor John McLoughlin. And together we created an equation of care and dependency. And you'll hear him kind of talking through what that is. But I'll kind of walk you back through it afterwards, but I'll let this play.
Lisa, when we've agreed on how we're going to work this now, we've tried different models over our different conversations and the like, and we've come to this model. And so I'm going to start by getting you to give me a number up to 10 for your caring concerns. So this is your responsibilities, such as your 3 children, your work, your studies, and so on. And where that would be today if you sort of looked at 10 as being your capacity as to all you could possibly have. And you have said that your score would be an 8. Okay, so that's a start. Then on the emotional side, the emotional concerns, and the examples that you've given me include your parents' health and such things. And there, your score is 6.5. So we have an 8 and a 6.5. Now we need to sort of weigh those. Is one of them taking more of your energy than the other? And so I'm asking you to take, say, 100% and split it. And you chose to split it in a way of 75% towards caring and 25% towards emotion. So the emotional concern that the score of 6.5 will get multiplied by 25% or 0.25, and the 8 gets multiplied by 75%. And when we add those together, okay, we end up with a score of 7.6 and a bit. Okay? So that's out of a possible 10. And that makes sense that it's closer to the 8 than the 6.5.
Sorry, I was chatting away there with my microphone on mute. You think you'd learn after a year and a half. So that was my final output. And I suppose one of the things that I wanted to talk about today was this space for non-consensus. And Simone de Beauvoir would say that time is stopped and clear forms and meanings rise. And as we've come back in, starting to see again in-person art and coming back into seeing actual live art, that has really, really struck me, that it's actually that being in the presence of art forms and actually having time to really watch allows us this space for non-consensus where we can actually be with an idea or a concept. So within my research, the name of my thesis, so as Aileen said, I graduated in December 2020. So it was It was a difficult moment in the sense that I never got to wear my red gown and my floppy hat, but at the same time, it was great to finally get it off and done. So the name of it was the Autonomy question, and it was an investigation of the aporia of autonomy and dependency through arts practice and social engagement. So what I was trying to look at was the concepts of autonomy and dependency and how we navigate these two very complex issues. It began, as I said, I'm a dancer, and this is where I began my training. And I was trying to find within the beginning of this PhD how I would look at my own artistic voice. How would I find my own artistic voice? And in a sense, the more that I kind of dug into what am I doing, everything kind of felt like a pastiche of other work that I'd done, or I'd worked with a lot of choreographers before, and everything felt like it was derivative of their work. So I kept kind of burrowing down into this concept. And at the time, and Kathleen has mentioned this a lot as well, actually, within her own research, the word autonomy was on people's lips in 2018. It's slightly associated with a different movement at the moment, and I don't think I'd be as interested in going back into looking at that. But in 2018, the word autonomy was being used in relation to repeal the eighth. So it was really being used in Ireland in relation to bodily autonomy and the women's rights to choose, or people's rights to choose. And it was being used internationally also. Within the Catalonians were seeking autonomy from Spain, so in terms of sovereignty. And a kind of open dominion. So from the individual to the group, it was being looked at, and it was a word that was on people's lips. And I wanted to look at it more in relation to my own artistic practice. And as the deeper I got into looking at my own movement, at my own art making, the more the heteronomous body was the thing that was emerging, the layers of influence, how I'm permeable to everyone and everything. So I decided, look, if I wanted to look at this idea of autonomy in society, or even for myself as an artist, I should ask the largest amount of people that I could consider. So I put together an idea and I brought it to the Limerick Arts Office. And together with them, we put in an application to the Arts Council. And this was before I worked for them, so there's no funny business. But we put in an application to the Invitation to Collaboration scheme, which is through the arts participation. And it's a fantastic scheme because it looks at kind of how we can bring art and art making into different into the relationship in society in different ways. So in the end, we put this idea of bringing young people and professional artists into the same building and creating this work together. And in the end, we had 62 young people across different youth groups. I had 10 professional artists. We had a symposium. So we had this really rich output and outpouring of art and art making. So I'm just going to share some photos that came from this, and you can just let these rumble on in the background. So within this this space, we created multiple works. So the 62 young people, I asked them each to consider, what is your concept of autonomy in society? And the same for the professional artists. And the thing that we did to support their autonomy was to give them the money, the time, the space, and the platform in which to dissect this and look at it. What emerged from it was incredibly interesting, and we had some of Limerick's finest youth groups. So we had Music Generation Limerick City, Limerick Youth Theatre, we had Limerick Youth Dance Company, and we had GOSH, so Gender Orientation, Sexual Health and HIV. And each of these groups made something completely different, and it was really quite fascinating, the level and the depth that they went to. So within the young people, the groups, I'll show you a little bit about it at the end, but there was pieces around gender autonomy, so made by a group of transgender teenagers who wanted to look at what did gender autonomy mean for them. Another group looked at the complexity of neutrality from the perspective of the UN, and it ended in a fantastic bloodbath. The youth groups in Music Generation, it's kind of, autonomy is kind of at the foundation of everything that they do. So they created lots of beautiful works that they performed in Dance Limerick. And then we also had, so Limerick Youth Dance Company proposed the body as the site of autonomy. And then within the professional artists, we had Seamus Nolan proposed the 10th president of Ireland. So he put forward to fight for other people's autonomy was more important than just resting within our own. So he placed the idea that we would propose William Dillane, so a young man who was killed in care in the state, and that we as a state would atone by putting William Dillane forward as president of Ireland for a day, a week, or a year. Unfortunately, he wasn't successful in getting the name onto the billing for the president's race, but it was a fantastic piece. Then we also had Siobhan Kavanagh and Adam Gibney proposing pieces around breath as the first utterance. We had Fergus Byrne create a piece. I sandwiched myself in amongst this and made a piece called The Body Autonomous. So then we had also had Ella Clark and Kathleen Turner and Company Milletta all making work. So in the end, it was a huge artistic explosion. And I suppose as we're here looking at research and art making, what it can bring up. And I suppose had I just asked these people dry, what do you think about autonomy in society? People would have given me their perspectives. But by asking people to really wrestle, really grapple with the concept, what we came across was something completely different, a really rich and vibrant explosion of art and understanding. At the Art and Autonomy conference that we held, we had Vittorio Bufacci, who is professor of philosophy in UCC, discuss autonomy. And one of the things that he said kind of set me down into my second work, and really also encapsulated so much of what we'd experienced by placing autonomy as kind of at the foundation and the core of what we were doing. One of the quotes that I think was just a fantastic quote from one of the young people was, the more I placed my own autonomy at the front, the more I realized that my autonomy couldn't encroach on another person's, and that we had to, that it wasn't an individual thing. It's a collective experience and not a selfish one. So in a sense, by really opening up that space and creating that boundary for people to really feel that, it was a very collective experience. And then Bufacci was talking about, if we have such a positive connotation towards the concept of autonomy, what does that do to its opposite? So from here, this sent me off down into a whole rabbit hole of my own experience of being kind of the support system of this project. So my role was to kind of support everybody through this. And as I've sandwiched into my biog, I'm also the mother of 3 children, one of them who had just been born. So he was brand new and came with me everywhere at the time. So in a sense, I was carrying so much in order to make this happen. And I wanted to look at what would be the opposite. So if I was to look at, in terms of Derrida's concept of deconstruction, if I was to look at the hierarchy of meaning, if we have such a positive connotation towards the concept of autonomy, what then do we have towards the more human elements of dependency, of care? So this set me to look around, right, what are the equations of care in our lives that support any autonomy that we experience? And I want to look at this by revoking, I suppose, that sounds very dramatic, but revoking some of my own autonomy. And I decided that in order to kind of really follow through with this idea of deconstruction, that I would turn it all on its head. So where one piece had, lots of venues, it had lots of people involved, I would do everything in the reverse. So it was just me on the streets. And as you saw in that first video, I was carrying a backpack, and I wouldn't be able to move unless somebody would walk with me. And wherever I would meet the equation, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second, I would drop my backpack and I would do a dance that I would do each time in every single space. But wherever the last person would drop me would be where I would move. So this led me to fantastic spaces in Cork, in Galway, in Limerick, and in Belfast. And what was really interesting as well was just how quickly I would move through certain cities and how hard it would be in other places. So I would have to ask people to walk with me. And I suppose if any of you have ever tried to, raise money for charity where you're, excuse me, you'll know that most people will say no. And so obviously that's absolutely fine. But I had to ask people to stop and walk with me for no other reason that I'd asked. Now, I know I'm not a challenging presence, and I know I'm not asking an awful lot of people, but I suppose as we come back into looking at the work, the idea that I would walk arm in arm and really close contact to people, chatting away for ages, for as long as that they wanted to, would mean I'd be like a one-woman super spreader event. So it was something I could never do again. So I suppose as I walked through these two ideas of deconstruction of how to look at something, this isn't something I would have done generally in my art making. And although we do within art making really go through the kind of we grind up an idea and we go through all of the aspects of it. The idea of bringing in that concept of how would I do everything in the opposite? How would I use that concept of deconstruction, that hierarchy of meaning, and how would I really kind of embed myself within it was something I really wanted to challenge within the work also. So I was wondering, do I have time to share a little more of that, Aileen?
Yeah, do, Lisa, because your presentation was interrupted. Yeah, so do, of course.
Okay.
About, four or 5 minutes.
Okay, perfect. That's great. So I'm going to show you a little bit from the performance that we did in Dance Limerick, and it'll give you some of the ideas of what the young people brought forward and some of the other performers as well. So let me go. So the Autonomy projects, yeah.
Lisa, you might want to check you've clicked the sound box. Yeah, we're getting it now. Great stuff, Lisa.
So thanks very much. And
thank you. Yeah.
Thanks a million.
Thank you very much. So let's go to some questions and answers. I see there's a few questions in the chat box already. Before we get to those, can I thank our three speakers, Lisa, Wayne, and Kathleen. These presentations, even though not intentionally, resonated in such interesting ways in terms of agency, in terms of letting go, with Wayne at one level at the extreme of absolutely letting go of one's bodily autonomy, and Kathleen at the other, feeling so frustrated about not having a voice and creating something and content that embodied everything she was feeling, and then Lisa facilitating other people to explore these incredible ideas. So lots of thank yous coming up in the chat box. Erin Fitzgerald just wanted to point out that she co-wrote the film Chewing with the Limerick Youth Theatre, which was in this project. So kudos to you, Erin, as well. Everybody's saying thank you across the board to all the presentations. You can always download the chat box afterwards. I'm conscious we're at 1:15. I have a bunch of questions, but we actually have some in the chat box already. So I'm going to direct you Matthew Noon's question, and he asks, I'm interested in the idea of your tussle with the truth. Do you feel the examples you've presented offer a truth that goes beyond an individual agenda? And do you feel you have transcended that tension you were describing, encountered in traditional theatre? Basically, Matthew is wondering, is it even possible to go beyond the individual truth or perspective, not just in theatre, but performance in general? And it's a great question, actually, because one of the challenges sometimes of arts practice research is people maintain it's about, because it's so embodied in the self, it's autobiographical, and there's always a danger of solipsism. But of course, that's to assume any research writer can write objectively, do any of us. So Wayne, do you feel the truth that the examples you presented goes beyond the individual agenda?
I don't know that I was so interested in the work, in stating a truth. I think I was more interested in transformation and probably magic, actually. I'm really interested, I didn't get to talk about it so much, but in the idea of magic as an artistic strategy, even if it fails, and as a place of focus. So when I talked about truth earlier on, what I was kind of complaining about, I guess, really, or moving away from, was truth as a shibboleth, like as a password into what can belong, what is worthwhile. So in a way, I wanted to make work that had no truck with that, really. It's quite a political word, and for me, and I think that truth speaking is a performative act. And I think that performance is always relational. That's a bit of a kind of complicated way to speak in the current terms, and I don't necessarily mean to bring it into an argument about identity at all. So do I think? I mean, for me, obviously, I went through and moved through places that were real. When I was making particularly the work with my body, well, all of the work really, I was encountering, it's kind of a Lacanian idea of the real, really, but like something that was that one can only be arrested and silent in front of, and in trying to kind of, I was trying to kind of encounter, the real, rather than necessarily the truthful. So maybe that's an answer to that, and very quickly, I did find a way to resolve something of that tension. With the theatre, I actually quite like traditional theatre. It's just I needed something else, so it's not a whole down on traditional theatre.
It's an interesting point, Wayne, because obviously what you did is also incredibly political, and we can see that theme across the board, how value systems inform the politics of the work of art, if you want to call it that, though sometimes people believe the aesthetic should be separate from its political work. Kathleen, do you see your art as doing political work?
Do you feel my art is doing political work? Is that what you said,
Yes.
Aileen?
Yes.
I don't know, to be honest with you. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's political. Is it personal? After the album went out, one really lovely small thing, well, I say small thing, it felt huge to me, was just starting to get messages from people who were listening collectively. So women who were listening with their kids, you know, and sitting down to actively listen to the song or watch the video, and that felt really important. In terms of political, it's hard to get a sense, I guess, of it, because we never kind of took it beyond that first performance that we did. So I guess I'll probably start to get a better sense of that when I go out. If I'm honest, it feels political to me, but I say that tentatively because I'm not. It's more. It comes from a much more emotive place. So, you know, and I guess it's inherently political because it was a song that was in lieu of a vote.
Well, it is in relation to both your points, and Raz Mikey has made the point in the chat box that art is political and intention doesn't necessarily constitute impact. You put it out there in the world, so it is relational. It's, you know, the death of the author, the birth of the critic or the audience. So yeah, there is that element of it for sure. Do you want to go ahead there, Kevin, and take another one from the chat box?
A question from the chat box. This was directed at Kathleen, but I suppose it's more of a general kind of research question, which is from Mary McCarthy, asking to know more about narrative autoethnography and books or resources on narrative autoethnography.
Yeah, there are quite a few books that I found really helpful. I would say in terms of autoethnography, there's a beautiful book it's edited by Bridie Lee Bartlett and Caroline Ellis, called Music Autoethnographies, and each chapter is an essay by a different artist examining something. I found the Hee-Wan Chang book, Autoethnography as Method, really helpful. And then in terms of narrative inquiry, which would be a different space, but used in a kind of complementary way for me, was a narrative inquiry by Clondinin and Connolly, Jean Clondinin, and I can't remember the first name of Connolly, but that was a great book. And those were three that I found really helpful.
Yeah, maybe if you have a chance, you could type those into the chat box. There might be other people. We might have two more questions. Before we take JJ's question, very briefly, Lisa, because in many ways your body was involved in your project, but in many ways you handed it over to others as well. How much do you see the role of the facilitator in arts practice as being critical to your own research and to your own value system, I guess?
God, that's a tough one, Aileen. I suppose holding that space for people was critical, and creating a space where people felt that they could fully embody what they wanted to do within the work was how I felt my role was in the Autonomy project. I also did make a piece as well, so my work was in there also. But I suppose I had more of a piece of kind of holding. But I think that, artists going into those spaces, I mean, now I'm in the Arts Council. So artists going into those spaces where you're kind of creating, you're curating, you're helping, you're trying to, do more than, not more than, but also create opportunities for people. I think that is crucial. So yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, though.
Well, it does. I mean, it's also another way of letting go in a different way from what Wayne did. But it's a type of way of letting go. Kevin, do you want to take JJ's question for Wayne?
I've got JJ's question there, and I'll post it into the chat as well, just so everyone can see. But JJ's asking, it was for Wayne, and he was curious about your quote, indirect to direct method of inquiry. Coming to a hypothesis avenue of investigation from an initially indirect interaction with the materials. And maybe you could expand on that process for us.
I think that's all hanging, a lot of that hangs around a quote from a book called Essayism by Brian Dillane. which is by indirection, find direction out. I think maybe what I was trying to articulate was something about the experience of moving from one way of practicing, which was to try and articulate something, you know, that was not necessarily already decided, but where you know, maybe you already had the play, or you already had the argument, or the initial kind of idea, and then you were kind of implementing something through the craft making and art making, rehearsals, repetitions, and so on. And this was more kind of idea of finding, say, a material or an object or a theme, and sitting with it, or sitting beside it, actually. So rather than trying to lift up what it was that you wanted to look at, whether that was gay rights or glass or water or your relationship with your mother, that instead one would kind of just be with it for a while and see how the two of you sat together, you know, and to try and listen to how you could begin by being with, rather than by manipulating or interrupting or those other things that actually are usually quite fated. Certainly in the theatre, everybody really likes if you kind of get your hands in and move everything around. And sometimes that work is also great, but for me, there was a real revelation through being with things like stones and bread, that I could have a much deeper relationship with the collaborators, both in like both real and what do you call it? I guess objects, things, with things and people. I have a much deeper relationship by being slower in my approach and less about myself.
It's actually an idea that has resonated with a number of people in the chat box, Wayne. You might want to have a look at it afterwards. Mel was just pointing out the being with rather than it being about. It strikes him as very similar to listening, you know, to just deep listening and being present to that. Lots of great references going into the chat box. If you go down to the 3 dots, you can actually save a chat box and you can cut and paste it into your messages. So please do that. We're coming towards the end of our session. There are some questions. Mary has a very expansive question. I don't know that we'll have the capacity to answer here, this idea of where are the opportunities in the arts right now. I don't know if anybody wants to take that on. It's a huge question. We're just emerging from pandemic situation. We're still dealing with how artists are paid, the spaces in which they can create work. It's if anybody wants to very briefly jump in, you can, but I think it's a huge question.
I'm going to just jump right in though, just on some levels. I just think that art needs to inhabit more spaces. I think that's what arts research does as well, and being part of more qualitative research, but also just going beyond everything and needs to take up more space and more oxygen generally in our society. And I think that that's, a critical piece, that if you think that, I can't go into those areas, I think art actually brings in so much. I mean, it doesn't have to prove itself either, but I just think that in terms of how we utilize art in society, such a powerful tool. And I think, everywhere more would be my my roar if Kathleen's to inspire me.
I mean, I think we're seeing this, the suffering many artists went through during lockdown, certainly with the live music industry in particular, but lots of other forms of performing arts as well, not getting the necessary support required from the government. So I think watch this space and watch responses to post-pandemic. And as you say, we all want to get into rooms together and create. So I think we're coming up to the time where we'll be switching to the book launch. So can I thank our 3 presenters, again, Kathleen, Wayne and Lisa, for a really stimulating and invigorating and much needed morning of looking at art and thinking about your process, which was extraordinarily enlightening and heartwarming and political. And thanks to Kevin and everyone else who helped make this session happen. And please do take the time, guys, to check the chat box, because you're getting a lot of kudos there, and clearly people are feeling the love and wanting to share it with you. So thank you all, and the next session will begin.
Thanks, Aileen.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much to Wayne and to Kathleen and to Lisa for those fascinating presentations. I've jotted down a few notes. Of course, you know, you have to be careful here that you don't reduce what were very complex and rich presentations, but I'll have a go anyway. The words I have here are performing rage, potatoes performing, and performing walking. And I'll certainly take some of those things with me. Thanks to Aileen for holding that space so deftly and so beautifully. JJ's question, of course, really interested me, and he himself is a very sophisticated listener to objects. And later on, we'll be hearing from Danny McCarthy, who is also a wonderful deep listener and somebody who elicits sound and communicates through the sound of objects as well.